The silence in Brenda Hayes' house was a comfortable, well-worn blanket. It was the same quiet she'd shared with her husband, Richard, in the final years before he passed, a silence punctuated by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Now, 5 years on, the quiet was her companion. At 68, the retired schoolteacher lived a life of deliberate, peaceful routine in the suburban Chicago home where she'd raised her son and nurtured a lifetime of memories. Her pension and Richard's life insurance had left her secure, a small fortress of financial stability against the unpredictability of the world. The world, however, had a way of knocking. It knocked on a Tuesday afternoon, a sharp, frantic rapping that was entirely out of place. Peering through the peephole, Brenda saw her son, Michael, and his wife, Tiffany. They looked diminished. Mike's usually confident shoulders were slumped, and Tiffany's face was pale and blotchy beneath her makeup. A knot of maternal anxiety tightened in Brenda's stomach as she unlatched the door. "Mom," Mike began, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry to just show up like this." Tiffany burst into tears, a dramatic, gulping sob that seemed to suck the air from the porch. "We didn't know where else to go," she wailed, burying her face in Mike's shoulder. Brenda ushered them inside, her mind racing. The living room, with its pristine carpets and photos of happier times, suddenly felt like an emergency room. She settled them on the floral sofa that Richard had always claimed was too soft, and waited. The story came out in a torrent of practiced despair. Mike explained he'd been laid off from his sales job, a corporate restructuring, completely out of the blue. Their savings, he claimed, had been wiped out by a sudden medical emergency for Tiffany, a ruptured appendix that required uninsured surgery. To cap it all off, their landlord, taking advantage of a hot market, had sold their apartment building, giving them only 30 days to vacate. They were broke, homeless, and utterly defeated. "We've been sleeping in the car for 2 nights, Mom," Mike said, his eyes welling up. It was a detail designed for maximum impact, and it landed perfectly. Brenda felt her resolve crumbling. A part of her, the pragmatic part that sounded a lot like Richard, whispered that the story was too perfectly tragic, a cascade of misfortune with no room for personal responsibility. Richard would have asked for proof, for pay stubs and hospital bills, but Richard was gone. All Brenda saw was her son, the boy she'd taught to ride a bike in the driveway, looking broken. The loneliness that often crept in during the long evenings felt sharp and acute in that moment. "We just need a little time to get back on our feet," Tiffany pleaded, looking up at Brenda with wide, desperate eyes. "A few weeks, maybe a month. We'll help around the house. We'll pay you what we can as soon as Mike finds something." The silence in the house was no longer comfortable. It was cavernous and empty. The thought of it being filled with the sounds of family, even a struggling one, was a potent lure. Pushing aside her fleeting doubts, Brenda made the decision that would unravel her life. "Of course you'll stay here," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "This is your home too." The relief that washed over their faces was instantaneous and theatrical. They hugged her, their gratitude so profuse it felt like a costume. As they went to retrieve their few duffel bags from their beat-up sedan, Brenda stood in the doorway of her quiet, orderly life, a sense of foreboding settling deep in her bones, even as she told herself she was doing the right thing. In the first few weeks, the house came alive. The oppressive quiet was replaced by the clatter of pans, the low hum of the television in the evenings, and the sound of laughter that Brenda hadn't realized she'd missed so desperately. Mike and Tiffany were model tenants, transforming from desperate supplicants into paragons of gratitude. Their presence was a constant, soothing balm on the raw edges of Brenda's loneliness. Mike, who had always avoided yard work, now spent weekends mowing the lawn, trimming the hedges, and cleaning the gutters, chores that had become increasingly difficult for Brenda. He'd come inside, wiping sweat from his brow, and say, "The least I can do, Mom. You saved us." Tiffany, meanwhile, took over the kitchen. She was a surprisingly gourmet cook, whipping up elaborate dinners of lemon herb chicken and risotto, filling the home with aromas that transported Brenda back to a time when the dining table was always full. Their evenings fell into a new routine. They'd watch game shows together, or Tiffany would insist on a game of Scrabble. oohing and aahing at Brenda's vocabulary. They were masters of affectionate performance. Hugs were frequent, as were compliments. "That color looks amazing on you, Brenda," Tiffany would coo. "You have to tell us all your stories from when you were a teacher," Mike would urge. They made Brenda feel not just needed, but interesting, vital. The cautious woman who had first opened the door to them began to recede, replaced by a mother basking in the warmth of her children's apparent devotion. Subtly, almost invisibly, they began to integrate themselves into the mechanics of her life. It started innocently. "Mom, you shouldn't have to worry about all these bills," Mike said one afternoon, seeing her at the dining table with her checkbook. "Let me help you set up autopay for your utilities. It's all done online now, it's so much easier." Brenda, who found the internet intimidating, gratefully accepted. She watched as he sat at her desktop computer, clicking through screens she didn't understand, inputting her bank information. He was so helpful. A week later, Tiffany undertook a grand organization of the office. "This room is a treasure trove of memories," she chirped. "But it's a bit of a mess. Let me just file everything for you, put it all in neat folders." For 2 days, she sorted through decades of paperwork, old tax returns, bank statements, and medical records. In a box labeled "Important Documents," she found Richard's death certificate, Brenda's birth certificate, and the one thing that held the key to everything, Brenda's Social Security card. Brenda saw her sorting and felt only relief that someone was finally tackling the clutter. She didn't see Tiffany pause, a flicker of something cold and calculating in her eyes, before slipping the small card into her pocket. One evening, watching Mike and Tiffany laugh at a sitcom on the sofa, Brenda felt a wave of profound contentment. The initial, nagging unease felt like a distant memory, a foolish flicker of cynicism. She had done the right thing. Her family was back under her roof. The illusion was flawless, and she was its most willing participant. The first crack in the perfect facade appeared in a crisp, white envelope. It was from a high-end retailer, Neiman Marcus, addressed to her. Brenda frowned, running her thumb over the embossed logo. She hadn't shopped there in 20 years, not since she'd bought a special dress for her anniversary with Richard. Inside was a statement for a new credit card, one she hadn't opened, with a balance of over $4,000. The charges were for a designer handbag and a pair of shoes. She felt a dizzying wave of confusion. She took the statement into the living room where Mike was reading the paper. "Michael, look at this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They're saying I bought a purse. I think there's been a terrible mistake." Mike took the paper from her, his brow furrowing with performative concern. "Wow, Mom, this is bad. Identity theft is no joke," he said, his tone grave. He examined the statement closely. "These crooks are getting so brazen. Don't you worry about a thing. I'll call their fraud department right now and get this sorted out. Worry about a thing. You shouldn't have to deal with the stress." He took the envelope and statement, and Brenda watched him walk into the office and close the door, feeling a surge of gratitude for his take-charge attitude. She never saw the statement again. A week later, the phone rang. A cheerful man from a major electronics chain asked to speak to Brenda Hayes. "Yes, this is she," Brenda answered. "Ma'am, I'm just calling to follow up on your recent online application for our store credit line to finance a home theater system. We just need to verify a few details." "A home theater system?" Brenda's blood ran cold. I didn't apply for anything. You must have the wrong person." Before she could say more, Mike was at her elbow, a concerned look on his face. "Who is it, Mom?" he whispered, then gently took the receiver from her hand. "Hello? Who is this?" His voice became sharp, protective. After a moment, he was firm. "My mother has not applied for any line of credit. You need to remove her name from your system immediately. This is harassment." He hung up the phone with a decisive click and turned to Brenda, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he scoffed. "They probably got your name from some public record, Mom. It's a phishing scam. They try to get you to give them your information. It's a good thing I was here." He patted her shoulder reassuringly, but the reassurance didn't land this time. The incidents were too close together, too specific. A memory surfaced, a piece of advice from Richard, spoken years ago after a neighbor had fallen for a phone scam. "Coincidences are just patterns you haven't figured out yet, Bren." The words echoed in the quiet space where Mike's explanation had been. She looked at her son, at his earnest, worried face, and for the first time, she didn't see a protector. She saw an actor. The seed of doubt, once a tiny dismissible thing, had found fertile ground. It began to sprout. The late autumn sun was warm on Brenda's face as she sat on her front porch swing, a novel resting unread in her lap. It was a peaceful Wednesday afternoon. Her neighbor across the street, Mrs. Gable, was meticulously watering her prize-winning roses, offering a friendly wave. The scene was a portrait of suburban tranquility, the kind of placid moment that Brenda cherished. It was shattered by the groan of hydraulics and the squeal of air brakes. A massive, grimy tow truck was backing into her driveway. It moved with an invasive confidence, its hazard lights flashing like malevolent orange eyes. Brenda's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of her 10-year-old Buick, safely tucked in the garage. This had to be a mistake. A burly man with a thick neck and a stained t-shirt jumped down from the cab, a clipboard in his hand. "Afternoon, ma'am," he grunted, not looking at her as he surveyed the driveway. "Here for the Lexus." "The what?" Brenda asked, standing up from the swing. "There's no Lexus here. You have the wrong house." The man glanced at his clipboard, then at the house number, then back at the paper. "Address is right. Name's Brenda Hayes. Repossession order for a 2023 Lexus RX 350. He gestured with his thumb toward the street, where a gleaming pearl-white SUV was parked directly in front of her house. Brenda had noticed it over the past few weeks, assuming it belonged to a new neighbor. Now, seeing it through the lens of the tow truck driver's words, a sickening realization dawned. Mrs. Gable had stopped watering her roses and was now watching with undisguised curiosity. The public nature of the confrontation sent a hot wave of shame through Brenda. Just then, Mike and Tiffany's old sedan pulled up. They got out, their arms full of grocery bags, and froze. Mike's face went from confusion to a mask of theatrical rage. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted, storming toward the driver. "Get your truck out of my mother's driveway." "Just doing my job, pal," the driver said calmly. "This vehicle is being repossessed for non-payment," the driver said, "registered to Brenda Hayes." Mike's eyes darted from the driver to the car, then to his mother's horrified face. He pivoted flawlessly. His rage was now directed at an unseen enemy. "This is what I was talking about, Mom," he yelled, loud enough for Mrs. Gable to hear clearly. "This is that identity theft ring. They didn't just open cards, they bought a car in your name. The nerve!" He put a comforting arm around Brenda's shoulders, while Tiffany rushed to her other side, her face a picture of pale, frightened innocence. "Don't you worry, Mom. I'm going down to the police station right now and filing a report. We are going to get to the bottom of this." As the driver efficiently hooked the pristine Lexus to his truck, Brenda felt nothing but a hollow void. She was barely aware of the neighbor's peering eyes, or the grinding sound of the winch hoisting the car. She was watching her son, his face a perfect blend of fury and concern, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was watching the performance of her life. The lie was no longer a secret contained within the walls of her home. It was now a public spectacle, and the shame of it was suffocating. The thorny vine of suspicion had wrapped itself tightly around her heart. That night, sleep was a stranger. Brenda lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the shadows in her room twisting into monstrous shapes. Every event of the past 2 months replayed in her mind on a torturous loop. The desperate plea, the cloying gratitude, the credit card bill, the phone call, and finally, the humiliating spectacle of the repossession. Mike's frantic, overly polished explanations echoed in the darkness, each one sounding more hollow than the last. Richard's voice was there too, a sad, knowing whisper in her memory. "You're a schoolteacher, Bren. You know when a child is lying." The guilt was a physical weight on her chest. To suspect her own son felt like the ultimate betrayal of a mother's love. But the fear was a sharper, more insistent pain. This was no longer about a few $1,000s on a credit card. This was an invasion, a violation that went deeper with every new discovery. By morning, her exhaustion had given way to a grim, painful clarity. She had to know the truth, no matter how ugly. The next day, she waited until Mike and Tiffany left, ostensibly to go to the library for their job search. As soon as their car was out of sight, Brenda went to her office, closed the door, and sat down at the computer Mike had so helpfully set up for her. Her hands trembled as she typed "Private Investigator Chicago Financial Fraud" into the search bar. The act itself felt sordid, cloak and dagger, something from a movie, not her life. She scrolled through a list of names and agencies, her heart pounding with a mixture of shame and resolve. She needed someone discreet, professional, someone who wouldn't make her feel like a fool. Her eyes landed on a name, Jack Donovan, a former detective with the Chicago PD's Financial Crimes Unit. His website was simple, no nonsense. It was perfect. With a deep breath, she locked her bedroom door and dialed his number, her voice barely a whisper. "Hello, my name is Brenda Hayes. I think I need some help." Jack Donovan's voice was calm and gravelly, devoid of judgment. He didn't press or pry. He simply listened as Brenda haltingly sketched out the situation, carefully avoiding naming her son, referring to him only as a long-term house guest. He suggested they meet at a small independent coffee shop in Oak Park, a town over where they wouldn't be seen coffee shop. 2 days later, Brenda sat in a worn booth, clutching a manila envelope. Inside were the few pieces of evidence she had. The original Neiman Marcus envelope she'd fished out of the recycling bin after Mike had disposed of it, and a piece of paper on which she'd scribbled the name of the electronics store and the date of the phone call. When Jack Donovan arrived, he looked exactly like his photo, a man in his late 50s with tired eyes that had seen too much. She told him everything, this time holding nothing back, the shame of admitting her suspicions about her own child bringing tears to her eyes. Donovan listened patiently, nodding occasionally. When she was finished, he said, "Mrs. Hayes, you have every right to be suspicious, and you are doing the only sensible thing, protecting yourself." He explained his fees and his process. Brenda slid the envelope, containing the documents and a retainer in cash from her emergency fund, across the table. As she left the coffee shop and walked back to her car, a profound sense of dread settled over her, mingled with the first flicker of relief. The truth was coming, and she would have to be strong enough to face it. The following week was an exercise in agonizing restraint. Brenda had to maintain a facade of normalcy, smiling through Tiffany's elaborate dinners and nodding along to Mike's fabricated stories about promising job leads. Every act of kindness from them now felt like a twist of the knife, every word of affection a carefully crafted lie. She lived in a constant state of high alert, her stomach perpetually in knots, waiting for the phone to ring. The call came on a Thursday morning. "Mrs. Hayes, it's Jack Donovan. I have my initial report. I think it's best we meet in person." His tone was grave, stripped of any professional pleasantries. It was the sound of bad news. They met at the same coffee shop. Jack didn't bother with small talk. He opened a thick blue folder on the table between them and turned it so she could see. "What I found is a systematic and deeply predatory fraud, Brenda," he said, using her first name for the first time. "And I'm sorry to tell you, it was orchestrated from inside your own home." The evidence was laid out in stark, undeniable detail. The first page was a log of IP addresses. The online applications for more than a dozen credit cards, in her name, using her social security number, had all originated from her home's internet connection. The dates and times corresponded with periods when she had been out of the house, at her book club, or grocery shopping. Next were bank statements for accounts she never knew existed, all linked to a primary checking account in the names of Michael and Tiffany Hayes. He showed her the flow of money, thousands of dollars in cash advances from the fraudulent credit cards being deposited and then immediately spent. Then came the photographs. Jack had obtained security camera footage. There was Tiffany, beaming as she swiped a credit card with Brenda's name on it at a Chanel boutique on Michigan Avenue. There was Mike, laughing with a salesman as he tried on a Rolex, the purchase later appearing on an American Express statement sent to Brenda's address. And there, in full color, was a photo of Tiffany climbing into the driver's seat of the pearl-white Lexus in a downtown parking garage, a stack of shopping bags in the passenger seat. "They've racked up over $90,000 in debt in your name so far," Jack explained, his voice gentle but firm. "They were meticulous. They signed up for paperless billing and monitored your email, which they had the password for. They redirected most of the physical mail to a P.O. box they opened. The Neiman Marcus bill and the car repossession were just the mistakes, the ones that slipped through their system. Brenda stared at the photos, her world tilting on its axis. The image of her laughing son, celebrating the theft of her financial security, was a physical blow. The helpful, loving children she had welcomed into her home were strangers, cruel and calculating thieves wearing the faces of her family. The warmth she had felt was revealed to be the heat of a slow-burning fire set to consume her entire life. The love and hope she had nurtured were dead, replaced by the cold, hard clarity of betrayal. Her face was a stone mask, her heart a frozen lump of ice. Brenda drove home in a state of suspended animation, Jack Donovan's report a dead weight on the passenger seat. The world outside her car window, the crisp autumn leaves, the blue sky, seemed insultingly cheerful, a stark contrast to the gray ruin of her inner landscape. When she walked through her front door, the smell of roasting garlic and herbs met her. Tiffany was in the kitchen, humming along to the radio as she prepared another special dinner for Mom. Mike was on the sofa, scrolling through his phone, and he looked up with a smile. "Hey Mom, just in time. Tiff's making her famous chicken cacciatore." Brenda looked at them, at their smiling, treacherous faces, and felt an absolute void. The grief was so immense it had passed into a realm of pure, cold emptiness. There was no anger, no sadness, just the chilling realization that the people she saw before her were not her family. They were parasites, and she was the host. She walked past them without a word and began sorting through the day's mail on the hall table. Tucked between a circular and a catalog was a thick, formal-looking envelope with a green stripe. It was from a legal firm on behalf of a mortgage company she'd never heard of, Paramount Lending Solutions. It was addressed to her, and the words "Certified Mail" were stamped in stark red ink. Her fingers, suddenly clumsy, fumbled with the seal. She took it to her bedroom and closed the door, her heart a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She sank onto the edge of her bed and unfolded the heavy paper. The word at the top of the page seemed to leap out at her, a visceral assault. Notice of intent to foreclose. The legal jargon swam before her eyes, but the meaning was brutally clear. A home equity line of credit, in the amount of $150,000, had been opened against her property 3 months ago. The loan was now in severe delinquency. The lender was exercising its right to seize the asset, her house. This was the final, unthinkable betrayal. They hadn't just stolen her money and her credit. They had come for her home. This house, paid off for a decade, was the container of her entire life. It was where she and Richard had toasted their 50th anniversary, where she had rocked a feverish Mike to sleep, where every wall held a ghost of a memory she cherished. It was the one patch of ground on this earth that was unequivocally hers, her sanctuary, and they had wagered it against a life of luxury and lies. In that instant, something inside Brenda shifted. The ice of her shock and grief began to harden, crystallizing into a diamond-hard resolve. The victimized old woman vanished. In her place stood Brenda Hayes, a fighter. The battle was no longer for her finances. It was for her life, for Richard's legacy, for the very ground beneath her feet. She picked up the phone, her hand steady, and dialed Jack Donovan. "Jack, it's Brenda," she said, her voice a flat, emotionless line. "They took out a loan against my house. They're trying to take my home." She paused, took a breath, and continued. "The time for waiting is over." She paused. "Tell me exactly what I need to do." On her nightstand, a silver-framed photo of her and Richard seemed to catch the light. She looked at his smiling face and made a silent vow. This ends now. The next 24 hours were a blur of focused activity. On the advice of Jack and the lawyer he'd recommended, Brenda moved with the precision of a general preparing for battle. She spent the morning at a copy shop, duplicating every damning piece of paper. Jack's entire report, the credit card statements, and the foreclosure notice. She called a locksmith and scheduled him to arrive at 7 p.m. sharp. Her final call was the most difficult. She spoke to a sergeant at the local police department, her voice steady as she explained the situation, and requested that 2 officers be present at her home that evening, not to make an arrest, but to keep the peace and act as witnesses. That evening she prepared the scene. She cleared the dining room table, the very table where they had performed their happy family charade for months. Then, like a prosecutor laying out evidence for a jury, she arranged the documents in a timeline of deceit. On the left, Jack's report, open to the page with the surveillance photos. In the center, a fan of credit card bills showing extravagant purchases. And on the right, in the place of honor, the foreclosure notice. They came home shortly after 6, laughing, their arms full of shopping bags from an outlet mall. "Mom, we got you the most beautiful cashmere Mike began, but the words died in his throat. He saw his mother standing by the table, her expression unreadable, her posture ramrod straight. He saw the papers. Tiffany followed his gaze and the color drained from her face. Tiffany, ever the actress, tried to play dumb. "Brenda, what is all this? Did something happen?" Mike attempted one last, desperate gambit. "Mom, what is this? Did that P.I. you hired feed you a bunch of lies? He's probably trying to frame us to get more money from you." Brenda let the silence hang in the air for a moment before she spoke, her voice calm, clear, and utterly devoid of the warmth they had so skillfully exploited. "There will be no more lies in this house." She didn't shout, she didn't cry. She simply narrated their crimes, picking up one piece of paper after another. "This is the application for a credit card, filed from my computer on August 14th, while I was at my book club. This is a photo of you, Tiffany, buying a $4,000 handbag with that card. This, Michael, is the loan document for the Lexus you so gallantly pretended was a mistake. And this," she said, her voice dropping, "is the foreclosure notice on my home. Richard's home." Their faces crumbled, moving through stages of disbelief, panic, and finally, a raw, ugly resentment. Tiffany began to sob, but this time the tears were real. Mike started to plead, his voice cracking. "Mom, we can explain. We were going to pay it all back, I swear." "No," Brenda said, the single word cutting through his babble. "You are done. I have spoken to a lawyer. I have spoken to the police. Officers will be here at 7 o'clock to escort you from my property. You have until then to pack one bag each of your personal belongings. The rest of your things will be put into storage. You can have your lawyer contact mine to arrange for their retrieval after you have been formally charged." As their pleading turned to panicked scrambling, Brenda walked to her favorite armchair and sat down, a queen on her throne, watching the chaos they had wrought. Right on time, the doorbell rang. It was the locksmith. A few minutes later, 2 uniformed police officers arrived. Brenda stood in her open doorway as Mike and Tiffany, defeated and stripped of their pretense, were forced to walk past the locksmith, changing the locks on the door they would never again enter. As they scurried to their car, just before the police cruiser pulled away, Brenda met her son's eyes one last time. She saw no remorse, only fury at being caught. She closed the door. She turned the new deadbolt. The solid, definitive thump of the lock sliding into place was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of the end, but it was also the sound of a beginning. Leaning against the solid wood of her front door, alone in the quiet of her reclaimed home, Brenda Hayes finally breathed.